You're listening to The Monday American, the show that puts the story back into history.
History is all about discovering the why, and I think that in that process it's important to never take the story out of history.
Making history come alive, one episode at a time. The show made for the people, by the people. Dive into The Monday American. Don't worry, we'll be gentle.
What you're about to listen to is part 4 of a series involving the American Civil War. And if you haven't listened to parts 1 through 3 yet, I would strongly encourage you to go back and do so. This episode specifically is one that really benefits from a great deal of context. And I did my very best, and I'm sure I failed at the task, as many historians have been debating over this for quite some time, but I attempted to do my very best in order to provide that context for you. Now, what this episode is, it's really the guts of the Civil War, and pardon the pun, but it's going to be the most graphic, and it's going to be the most battle-oriented in really displaying the true hellish nature of war, specifically America's bloodiest war to date, in which it saw the bloodiest single battle and the bloodiest single day in our nation's military history. I really think that going back, listening to parts 1 through 3 will help understand and help you get more out of this episode. That said, if you just want to keep marching on and listening to this episode, then I'm not with you and I can't stop you, so you do your thing. Now, I am extremely excited to do what I'm doing right now, begin to record this episode, because for all the research I've done, whether it was studying history as a student or preparing just research for any of these episodes I've done in the past, this one has been the one where it's been hard to put the books down that I'm reading. And I've got 8 or 9 books maybe that I've been reading. Most of them I've already read, some of them I never have. But even with my obscene fascination for World War II, this episode has been the one where I have to remind myself that I'm researching an episode and not just leisurely reading history like I do, as I'm sure some of you nerds out there, fellow nerds I should say, do with me. And I really, really hope that you enjoy this episode as much as I have enjoyed reading and researching and just the fascination behind the Civil War. So that said, let's dive into the 4th part of the story behind the American Civil War. At the end of part 3, we left off with a couple battles by, at the time, Lieutenant Colonel, I believe, Ulysses S. Grant. I believe it was Lieutenant Colonel. I can't remember. It feels like it's been forever, but at Fort Donelson and Fort Henry. And those were probably the first real victories for the Union up until that point. Now, what I need to do, because I believe I got a bit ahead of myself, I need to backtrack a little bit, and I need to set up some context of this story, because what we're about to go through is the end result is going to be one of the most amazing, one of the most horrific, and one of the most exhilarating to follow, looking back on it as history, cat and mouse games of 2 generals in warfare that I think I might have ever seen. And that's, of course, between Robert E. Lee and the future president, Ulysses S. Grant. And it didn't at all shape up to be that way. And it was a fairly surprising thing to happen in the first place if you were following the events of the time, because most people expected Robert E. Lee to take command of the Union armies. Now, all of his life, Robert E. Lee was driven by, forged from, and to an inescapable degree haunted by a sense of destiny. By birth and inheritance, he was tied to the Union, to its creation, its preservation. 2 of his ancestors, Richard Henry and Francis Lightfoot Lee, had signed the Declaration of Independence. His father, whose name was Lighthorse Harry Lee, which has got to be the coolest name in history, was a celebrated Revolutionary War general. He was an ardent Federalist and the soldier of whom President George Washington handpicked to stamp out the 1794 Whiskey Rebellion, the young country's first secessionist threat. And it was none other than Harry Lee who had eulogized General and President George Washington with the phrase, quote, "first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen." Now, Southern history ran equally deep in Lee's blood, and he was related to most of Virginia's first families, the Lees, Carters, Randolph, the Fitzhughs, the Harrisons. And for more than a century, his family, his counselors, burgesses, and aides to the king, and then his revolutionary soldiers and planters and foreign emissaries, had played a leading role in the history of the Old Dominion state. His own father was at various times a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, a Virginia delegate to the Continental Congress, and 3 times a governor and Virginia congressman. In fact, former President Washington made a conspicuous show of publicly voting for candidate Lee, his father, and Robert E. Lee was himself born at Stratford, which is a home overlooking the Potomac and one of the most famous estates in all of Virginia. Now, all that is to say, Robert E. Lee was about the most American person you could think of at that time. But as American as Lee may have been, he had what was fairly common at the time in his view of states versus federal and national rights and the hierarchy of the whole thing. He viewed his state of Virginia, like most people did at the time, as primary. And I think what I'm doing is I'm offering a very dangerous apology for Lee and taking the head of the Confederate Army, taking that position. And I say it's dangerous because in today's light, Lee has not gone down favorably. However, I'm aware that I was raised in the South. I lived there pretty much my whole life in South Carolina, the first state to secede. And up until very, very recently, as I'm recording this on the end of January, there was a billboard that was the Confederate flag on a back road at a crossroads. And it was there until, as long as I can remember, until probably like a month ago, that just said the South will rise again. And I'm aware that my upbringing, the location I lived in, that might give some bias or some tendency to be lenient in my historical review of some of the decisions. However, I'm a student of history, and the one thing that I know for fact that is a popular opinion of the day is that, well, the popular opinion is that Robert E. Lee was a traitor and a racist slave hater who wanted nothing more than to cause war and to go to war for slavery. If that's what you're under the impression of, or if that's what you have heard, that is simply not true, and there's nothing in any historical sense to give credence to that argument. So what I'm saying is that Robert E. Lee was faced with a decision, and I'm just trying to do the best I can to recount his decision. So one by one, the southern states were leaving the Union, and as war loomed in April of 1861, on the very same day that Lee learned of Virginia's withdrawal of the Union, the U.S. General-in-Chief Winfield Scott summoned him for an urgent meeting in Washington, and that meeting gave Lee a stunning offer. And it even bared the seal of President Abraham Lincoln, and that was for the command of the new Union Army. Now, all of his life, for Robert E. Lee, this was the one position that he had coveted. It offered him a chance to walk in the footsteps of not only his own father, but also of the father of the country, with a chance for military glory rivaling even George Washington's. In the 3 tremulous hours that they spoke, of which no record exists, by the way, Lee not only declined the offer, which was surely the most painful decision of his life, but he also resigned his commission from the Army. And it just made no sense to them at the time. And what he said in his defense was, quote, "I cannot raise my hand against my birthplace, my home, my children." And he explained that, quote, "Save in the defense of my native state, I never desire again to draw my sword." 5 days later, making good on his argument that he never wanted to draw a sword other than to save his own state. He accepted an appointment as commander-in-chief of Virginia's military forces, and 3 weeks after that, he was made a brigadier general in the Confederate Army. He did it for honor, but he had no illusions, and he did have the heaviest of hearts. He said, quote, "I foresee that the country will have to pass through a terrible ordeal. I did only what duty demanded, and if it were to be done over again, I should act in precisely the same manner." And that last part was him reflecting years later on the whole ordeal. And if you think that he had no qualms about resigning his commission in the United States Army and drawing a sword against his own countrymen, you are mistaken. And I only say that because I know that he has gone down in light recently negatively. And of course, he was an enemy of the state, so you can't forgive that. But you have to be able to understand, I mean, the benefit of history that we have today. And this argument that, this popular argument of the day, whatever it may be, is simply disregarding history. To assume that he had no hesitation and to assume that he was nothing but a traitor is just simply inaccurate. Now, he's not a hero. He is a enemy of the state. He was, but you can't just ignore some facets of history in favor of the ones you want to see or the ones that you think are more important. You have to take into consideration all aspects. And that's why I bring up this whole issue, which is surely one of the most dangerous topics anyone who's composing a Civil War documentary, podcast, whatever you may have, it's got to be one of the touchiest subjects that there is. But I don't think it's worth leaving out. I think it's too important a situation to just skim over. And with all that said, it is worth noting that Robert E. Lee was probably one of the best military minds our country will ever see. And there's no disputing that. So, although the Confederate Army was smaller in size, was less in money, and essentially was a brand new nation trying to figure it all out, they ran the ship on the Union Army. And there's a few reasons why. One of them was because of General George McClellan, and overall the Union leadership was subpar at best. He was a confident, able, and promising soldier who was proving to be an unsatisfactory general-in-chief. He was overly cautious when it came to committing troops to combat, and he never thought he had enough men for the task at hand. He consistently overestimated the size, strength, and resources of the enemy. And that led him to see more formidable obstacles than were actually there. Now, most of the war's professional soldiers, he resented politicians who interfered with his military plans, and he was especially annoyed by President Lincoln. And Lincoln had a habit of assigning far more men than General McClellan thought was necessary for the defense of Washington. His resentment of Lincoln, whom he called a fool and worse, would become very open and very brazen. So needless to say, Abraham Lincoln and George McClellan had several issues throughout the entire Civil War. After a defeat known as the 7 Days Battle, there was a sort of turning point for the North, and especially for Abraham Lincoln. The demand by radical politicians in his own party for a tougher war policy had grown throughout the spring and summer. Following the disaster on that campaign, Lincoln began to think that the politicians under him might be right. He decided to abandon the, quote, kid glove warfare of the preceding year and wage a no-holds-bar, relentless war against a formidable foe. His change of heart, though, was really rooted in disappointment. He had always believed that the majority of white Southerners, especially in the Upper South, retained strong attachments to the Union, and that given a little bit of time and patience, those old patriotic feelings would resurface, and the people would rise up to help overthrow the Confederacy. And he had ordered advancing Union armies to treat non-combatants with respect, to win the trust of the white Southerners by showing that the U.S. had no desire to injure them or ruin their region. Yet outside of Northwest Virginia, no widespread Unionist revolt had come. Instead, hundreds had taken up arms as guerrilla soldiers for the Confederacy, and they assisted that army by murdering Union soldiers. Lincoln had to concede that his conciliatory policy was failing. And he also decided that his new strategy must include some form of black emancipation. And in calling for a harsher war policy, the more energetic and radical Republican politicians had insisted on this point as well. Emancipation, that they argued, would revitalize the war effort, and they had been pushing Lincoln in a direction and at a speed he was not prepared to go. But by the summer of 1862, the president really didn't have much of a choice. He had to calm down the political clamor, and given the need for a tougher military policy, there was no question that emancipation would also undermine the Confederate war machine, which was, at the time, completely shellacking their Union Army. Now, like I said, Lee had been pretty much completely victorious against the Union armies with a handful of defeats here and there, but really I think all of them were in armies other than his, or in theaters of war other than what he was fighting. And those early victories now emboldened Robert E. Lee to make an even more audacious move. He had always preferred the offensive part of the Confederacy's offensive-defensive strategy, and although he and Jefferson Davis worked pretty well together, the general was clearly more impulsive than the president, and perhaps a little bit more voracious in his attack of the enemy. And that does go to show you that a politician is always going to be more cautious than a general, in pardon the pun, in general. With the Federals reeling from his blows, he wanted to carry the war into Union territory, thinking that he would complement a bold Confederate advance already underway in Kentucky. He decided to enter another border slave state controlled by the Federals, the state of Maryland. Now, he saw several advantages into a raid into Maryland, and he presumed, attract recruits to Confederate service, move the fighting out of Virginia during the coming harvest season, live off the countryside and replenish his declining supply of horses and mules while drawing Union troops from the west, and he would hurt the Republican Party in that fall's northern elections and put diplomatic pressure on Europe to recognize the Confederacy as a sovereign nation. A single impressive victory could accomplish that much, and his mere presence across the Potomac River, as Lee believed, would spread panic throughout the North. We should take a second to note that that's an impressive slew of hopes for one offensive campaign. But this was the day and age where imagery mattered so much in the mind of the people in the nation, and the Confederate States of America were strongly petitioning Europe for official recognizing of their country and aid. So Robert E. Lee entered Maryland during the first week of September of 1862. But he had trouble from the start. What he called stubborn Union garrison at Harper's Ferry stood its ground as Lee approached and threatened his communication lines should he go around it. He had Jackson's corps to stay behind to force a surrender while the rest of the army moved forward. Then one of his staff officers lost a copy of the Army's projected movements for the campaign. This is one of the most famous stories in the Civil War. A Union patrol investigating the sudden show of rebel force in Maryland found those orders wrapped, as improbable as it sounds, wrapped around some cigars, and they turned them over to General Mcclellan. And when the Union commander, taking advantage of this bit of luck, moved more swiftly than customarily had been done before to intercept the rebel army, Robert E. Lee sensed that something was amiss. And that is a theme of Robert E. Lee throughout the entire war. He had this otherworldly sixth sense of the enemy's movements. Keep in mind, this is the day and age there where they didn't have drones, they didn't have really good binoculars, they didn't have very much reconnaissance at all, and it was mainly just relying on reports of the battlefield to come back to them so that they could make the next move. And Lee had this innate ability to be able to get into the mind of his opposing general and understand the man and be able to predict his movements. And until the very, very end of the war, he was successful every single time. And because he knew General George McClellan, knowing that him moving very quickly was not the cautious general that he had come to know, Lee, with his army divided, considered withdrawing from Maryland until he received word that the corps commanded by Jackson that he had left behind at Harper's Ferry, had captured the fort, and they would soon rejoin him. So Lee decided to make a stand at the little town of Sharpsburg. So the Battle of Sharpsburg, or Antietam, began with an infantry attack against Lee's left flank at 5:30 in the morning on September 17th. The 35,000 Confederate soldiers spread north and south of the town on a line 2 miles long. They absorbed charge after charge by General Mcclellan's 87,000 men in some of the most historic clashes in modern warfare. Fighting rolled over expansive cornfields and pastures and swirled through the woods surrounding a small Dunker church. In the center of the rebel line, dead and dying Confederates soon filled a sunken road known thereafter as the Bloody Lane. Lee had anchored his left flank on the Potomac River, which ran behind rebel lines. It was a dangerous position, for had the Federals turned either flank or penetrated his defenses, Lee's army would have been pushed back into the river. It would have been virtually annihilated. Now, the reason that Lee was not defeated at Antietam was because of Union failure. It was a sluggish performance of several corps commanders who failed to attack at the appointed time, and the assault unfolded. It was a piecemeal. It never mustered enough weight for a knockout punch. One Union officer surmised shortly after the battle that, quote, "There seems to be no doubt that if McClellan's orders had been carried out, the attack would have been so complete a success that but little of the rebel army would have escaped." As it was, Lee always was able to concentrate his force on the exact point where the attack was going to be made. Now, the best chance for the Union Army came against the thinly manned Confederate right flank. It was positioned on some bluffs overlooking Antietam Creek. About 500 Georgians held off, and this should go to show you McClellan's leadership. 500 Georgians were able to hold off 12,000 Federal troops for 3 hours, while those Federal troops were trying to cross the creek's very narrow bridge. And they finally broke through, but just as they prepared to turn and attack the very exposed and very badly weakened center of Lee's line, General Ambrose P. Hill arrived with the last of Stonewall Jackson's men from Harper's Ferry. They crashed into the right flank of this final threat, and they saved the day for Robert E. Lee. This was a particularly gruesome battle. One soldier from the Union remembers writing on it and saying, quote, "No tongue can tell, no mind conceive, no pen portray the horrible sights I witnessed this morning." Many soldiers wrote very similar lines following every battle of the war, but these words, written on this evening, they told a special truth. After 12 hours of combat, 2,100 dead Union soldiers and 1,500 Confederates lay scattered over the fields surrounding Sharpsburg. In addition, the Union had 9,500 wounded men and the Confederates had 7,700. It proved to be the single bloodiest day of the war. The soldiers remembered, quote, "We were glad to march over the field at night, for we could not see the horrible sights so well. Oh, what a smell! Some of the men vomit as they went along." And that was the Battle of Antietam, which remains to this day America's single bloodiest day in military history. Now, although the Battle of Antietam was technically a stalemate, the Confederate Army, led by Lee, was retreating at the end of the ordeal. The Union Army as well kind of retreated to gather their wits about them. The victory, as it were, went down as such by the Union Army. Technically, Lee's forces left first. And a lot of this war, you will see technical victories proclaimed by one side or the other. And it's kind of this odd shift of the new age of warfare, or this 19th century age of warfare, in a transition into more modern warfare, but clinging on to the old romanticisms of wars in the past, in the sense that you see many times people waiting for the other side to make the first move of retreat just to claim victory for themselves. And it's something that's kind of foreign to us today, but this is a very interesting time in the country and the world's history. The defeat for the Confederates was not really much of a defeat, and the victory was not much of a victory. Now, the only reason that Lee's army wasn't completely annihilated was because of General George McClellan's hesitancy and his fear of losing his army and being defeated by Lee. If he had attacked correctly, the war might have been over, probably would have been over. But be that as it may, Lincoln and the Union declared it as a victory in which Lincoln had been waiting for a bit of positive good news to ride the wave to make his very famous Emancipation Proclamation. And when he did that, he changed the face of the war entirely. By the fall of 1862, more than a year of war had been going on. It left thousands of soldiers dead, maimed, and suffering from debilitating disease. Families were divided, communities wrecked, wealth had been lost, lives had been destroyed. The issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation changed the war's moral tenor and political consequences, but neither side moved any closer to peace. No end to the killing, the mass onslaught was yet in sight. If anything, the proclamation deepened the war, as it meant the South would have to fight on with no hope for a political compromise unless Lincoln were to lose the election of 1864. Now, after that awful carnage that was the Battle of Antietam, followed by weeks of inactivity, President Lincoln had seen enough of what they called him, the young Napoleon, who was General George McClellan. And on November 7th of 1862, Lincoln fired him from the command of the Army of the Potomac, which is essentially the head of the Union Army. And Lincoln's act of firing him spread consternation in the Army. McClellan was very popular among the men, and many officers hated what they considered outside political interference, and they identified with their commander, who had spent a great deal of energy fighting the Republican administration. One lieutenant asked, quote, "How can we succeed when mere trickster politicians control the movements of our generals and dictate how and when they must act?" And this is nothing new to warfare, and if you listen to the American Revolution series, you'll remember that I spent a great deal of time noting how rare it was for George Washington to be so politically agreeable. So the theme of the war of politicians and generals, that seems to be an undying theme of humanity and warfare. When McClellan took his formal leave, Wainwright noted, quote, "Such a sight I shall never see again. Not a word was spoken, no noisy demonstration of regret at losing him, but there was hardly a dry eye in the ranks. Very many of the men wept like children, while others could be seen gazing at him in mute grief, one may almost say despair." Lincoln replaced General McClellan with General Ambrose Everett Burnside, who, yes, is responsible for the nickname of Sideburns, the hairstyle. He had performed pretty ably as a corps commander, but had twice turned down the opportunity to lead the army himself. He still didn't really want the job, but this time he accepted when he was urged by his fellow officers, who preferred him to the bombastic Joseph Hooker. And Burnside wouldn't last terribly long as the commander of the army, but it's worth pointing out that the Union leadership is partly responsible for their inability to defeat the Confederates on any battlefield, as well as Lee's strategic mastery, and it shows just how important good leaders are on the battlefield. Now, if Lincoln thought that Burnside was the answer to his issues and problems with the war, he would have been sorely mistaken. He was eventually replaced, and they just continued a revolving door of leadership in the Union Army for the generals. Now, still convinced that a decisive victory could end the war and ensure independence, as he had hoped it would in Antietam, Robert E. Lee persuaded Richmond, which is the Confederate States government capital, Richmond, Virginia, that another invasion of enemy territory was necessary. Since February of 1863, he had been considering an ambitious strategy that targeted Pennsylvania, a state rich in supplies and food, and such an invasion might strengthen the growing Northern peace movement and reopen the possibility of foreign recognition. He had hoped to begin his campaign in May, but General Hooker's advance and the subsequent Battle of Chancellorsville changed all that. Now, with Hooker defeated and enough ammunition and animals with which to go forward, Lee commenced his offensive operations in what would be his last offensive operation of the entire war. Now, Lee was delayed once again when a Union reconnaissance mission to determine his position resulted in the largest cavalry battle of the war at Brandy Station on June 9th. However, by June 15th, his advance units crossed the Potomac River into Maryland. And on June 25th, his army entered Pennsylvania to begin the most famous battle of the entire war. Now, all the while Lee was doing all this, Hooker was tracking his movements and nudging his own army very cautiously towards Lee's line of advance. But having been so recently humbled at the Battle of Chancellorsville, he seemed hesitant to engage with Robert E. Lee. He also bickered openly with the Union General-in-Chief Henry Halleck and the Secretary of War Edwin Stanton over military strategy and other issues, which only added to his unpopularity in Washington. When Hooker angrily offered to resign over a disagreement with Halleck, Abraham Lincoln, who had pretty much lost confidence in Old Fighting Joe was his nickname by this time, accepted his resignation and replaced him with General George Gordon Meade. Now, Meade, who bore the nickname the Old Snapping Turtle, was a West Point graduate and Mexican War veteran who had risen steadily in the ranks from the brigade to corps commander. He was intelligent, diligent, and a very skilled tactician. He had an explosive temper that even Ulysses S. Grant described as, quote, beyond his control at times, which is saying quite a bit for Grant to be the one saying that. The Battle of Gettysburg. It wasn't even supposed to be fought there, but when Confederate troops from General Henry Heth's division wandered into Gettysburg on July 1st, looking for provisions and signs of Union troops, they encountered General John Buford's cavalry scouting ahead of the rest of the Union Army. Buford's dismounted troops skirmished with the Confederates until Federal infantry arrived. By the end of the day, the Confederates had pushed them back through the town. The Union troops then positioned themselves on Seminary Ridge to the southwest. By the morning of July 2nd, both armies were concentrating on Gettysburg. 88,000 Union troops against 75,000 Confederate troops. The Confederate cavalry commander, J.E.B. Stuart, trying to reenact his rides around McClellan and make up for the embarrassment of being surprised at Brandy Station, had gone on a combined raid and reconnaissance mission to circle the Union Army, and as a result was entirely out of touch with his own army. Lee found himself in these critical opening hours of the battle in a position much like Hooker's at Chancellorsville, without the, quote, eyes and ears of his own cavalry. And consequently, on that first day of fighting, Lee did not know what he faced, an extremely precarious situation in enemy territory. On July 2nd, the Union line resembled a long fishhook that started on its right at Culp's Hill, curved southward around Cemetery Hill, and ran along Cemetery Ridge and extended towards two hills, known as Little and Big Round Top, on its left flank. Lee ordered attacks against both flanks, but it was not until late in the afternoon that fighting commenced. On the Confederate left, General Richard S. Ewell, who commanded half of what had been Jackson's corps, hesitated and stumbled at Culp's Hill. On the Confederate right, Longstreet, who had rejoined Lee after the failed siege of Suffolk, struggled to organize his men for an attack. The Federals, meanwhile, had troubles of their own, theme of the war for them. General Daniel Sickles, acting without orders, pushed his corps forward to seek high ground in a peach orchard. The movement created an exposed salient, or a bulge, in the Union line. July 2nd, 1863, marked some of the fiercest fighting of the entire war. In places such as the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and Little Round Top, casualties ran extraordinarily high. The 1st Minnesota Brigade, charging against a rebel advance late that day, lost 215 of its total 262 men. Alabamians and Texans rushed gallantly and repeatedly up the steep incline of Little Round Top before retreating, exhausted and bloodied. Colonel William Oates of the 15th Alabama Regiment recalled the slaughter of that day when he said, quote, "My dead and wounded were then nearly as great in numbers as those still on duty. They literally covered the ground. The blood stood in puddles in some places on the rocks. The ground was soaked with the blood of as brave men as ever fell on the red field of battle." The next day, on July 3rd, Lee attacked again, despite strong objections from Longstreet, who argued that the Confederates should withdraw and find a better defensive position between Meade's army and Washington. Lee originally planned to repeat his assault on Culp's Hill and Little Round Top, But when the Federals took initiative and attacked rebel positions below Culp's Hill that morning, Lee changed his mind. He decided to launch a frontal assault where Meade would least expect it, the very center of the Union line at Cemetery Ridge. General George E. Pickett division of fresh troops who had sat out the first 2 days of battle would spearhead this attack. Portions of other infantry commands joined Pickett's Virginians, some 13,500 men in total, and an artillery barrage would precede their advance. At approximately 1 p.m., the Confederate guns opened fire for that barrage. Meade, meanwhile, was not caught unaware. Having seriously considered a withdrawal, he finally decided after a council of war with his own generals on the previous night to stay and fight. Guessing that Lee would target his center, Meade reinforced the position and ordered his men to dig in. Sometime around 3 p.m., 11 Confederate infantry brigades marched in perfectly formed columns across the gently rolling fields between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge. The temperature was exceedingly hot. The air was heavy with humidity, acrid smoke, and the foul smell of dead men and horses. The charge became known as Pickett's Charge, a name coined by Richmond newspapers to highlight the role of Virginians in the advance. It turned out to be a disaster. Although it later became the stuff of legend, Lee had made a horrific mistake. Only a small number of desperate Confederates pierced the Union line on Cemetery Ridge, and they were soon overwhelmed. He had severely miscalculated his opponent and misjudged the ability of his own men. George Meade was not Joe Hooker, George McClellan, or Ambrose Burnside. He did not lose his nerve, but rather stood his ground against Lee. Soon after the charge collapsed and the survivors staggered back, Lee told at least 2 officers that the failed effort was completely his own fault. In his official report written a few weeks after the battle, he admitted, quote, "More may have been required of them than they were able to perform." In retrospect, he thought the attack seemed a little bit different from Burnside's futile assault against Marye's Heights. Public criticism from the Confederate press, politicians, civilians, and even a few Army officers promoted Lee to ask President Davis to replace him. Davis refused, stating, quote, "To ask me to substitute you by someone in my judgment more fit to command or who would possess more of the confidence of the Army or of the reflecting men of the country is to demand an impossibility." And on July 4th, both armies sat and eyed each other, binding their wounds, burying their dead, and waiting for more fighting. But none came. Eventually, Lee retreated across the Potomac River to Virginia. Meade, his own army bruised and battered, did not pursue, which has gone down in history as one of the more controversial of all the controversial Union general tactics that occurred in that war. If he had pursued them, he might have been able to finish them off. But they didn't. And in the time between now and then, historians, novelists, even poets, and just enthusiasts of the war in general would christen that Battle of Gettysburg as the decisive turning point of the American Civil War. And in retrospect, many would argue that this was the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. And it was a tremendous battle. It lasted 3 days and produced more than 50,000 casualties. The Federal Army lost some 23,000 men, and the Confederates lost more than 28,000 men. Pickett's charge became the symbolic high watermark of the Confederacy and the supreme example of Southern white male courage and sacrifice. For the Union, it was more of a defensive victory than a decisive one. The war lasted 21 more months after this. Would it have ended if Lee had won the battle? Would the Confederacy have gained its independence? A close examination of the political situation in the North and military events in the Western theater suggest that the answer to both those questions would be no. A Confederate victory at Gettysburg would have fueled the anger of peace Democrats and their criticism of the Republicans and would have strengthened Confederate resolve, but it is pretty doubtful that Lincoln would have been ready to give up the fight just then. And in addition to that, Lee's army had been severely, severely damaged. He would have been hard-pressed to continue that offensive after suffering such massive losses in his army. However, this is all speculation. And I say that it's speculation because we don't know if that's what would have happened or not. In reality, something different happened. Lee continued to fight, and the Union did not respond well with their leaders. And eventually it led to the replacement of generals until they got to Ulysses S. Grant, whom Abraham Lincoln admired for his very aggressive style of warfare. It was a very, very attack-oriented and aggressive style, especially compared to, let's say, Mcclellan, who was so cautious and so tepid in his warfare that it makes Grant look like a bulldog, just so aggressive. But it ended up working. So Grant, unlike the very cautious George Gordon Meade or McClellan, Meade was the commander in the East, who undoubtedly had popularity after Gettysburg, the patience was wearing thin. And Ulysses S. Grant, who was deemed the hero of the Vicksburg campaign, had proven relentlessly aggressive, and admiration for him was on the rise. During the winter of 1864, Congress debated a bill that would commission Grant the first American lieutenant general since George Washington. On March 3rd, Henry Halleck telegraphed Grant twice to tell him the commission had been signed by the president and to order him to Washington to take over the direction of the war. Grant, who was short, tired, his uniform covered with a linen duster, he did not give the appearance of that Caesar-type figure from the West when his 14-year-old son Fred had quietly approached the desk of Washington's fashionable Willard's Hotel late in the afternoon of March 8th. The desk clerk reckoned as how there was probably a room on the top floor which Grant said suited him. So he signed the register, quote, U.S. Grant and Son, Galena III. Seeing this signature, the clerk sprang into action, gave Grant the customary salute, and grabbed his bags to lead the hero upstairs. That was the last moment of private life for Grant in Washington. When he was recognized coming down for dinner that evening, the whole room rose to its feet and rhythmically shouted his name. Grant, who finally got up and bowed, was so embarrassed that he could not finish his own meal. And that evening at the White House, another cheering throng compelled Grant to stand for an hour on a crimson plush sofa so all could gawk at this very plain man of whom total victory was expected. As he took charge, he was evolving a grand strategy for concluding the war, and he had doubtlessly talked through this redesign with his most trusted and brightest lieutenant, William T. Sherman. As Sherman accompanied Grant on the first leg of this trip east, Grant intended to manage a simultaneous attack across several fronts into all regions of the Confederacy, not just to direct the Army of the Potomac. Early in the conflict, following Napoleonic precedents, generals on both sides had attempted to fight and win this big climactic battle that would annihilate the enemy and army and end the conflict. That had been the intention of both armies at Bull Run, but the result, far from complete Southern victory, only led to both sides mobilizing more resources. The next year, Robert E. Lee had been angry with himself for not destroying McClellan's army during the Peninsula Campaign of 1862, and even as he approached Gettysburg, if in a somewhat muted fashion, Lee had hoped to fight that climactic battle there. And what we see is Grant understanding that that wasn't going to be the case. And what ended up happening was the most exciting from a historian standpoint, and I'm not trying to call myself a historian, but to read about this later, the most exciting cat and mouse chasing game in warfare that I think I might have ever come across. And it involved Grant and Lee outdoing one another and chasing each other across land in America to ultimately end the war. One notable difference about Grant in charge of the army as opposed to any of the other generals was the politicians' confidence in him, really. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, who was awaiting the next big battle, was glad to set down at least a little bit the heavy mantle of military leadership that his earlier mediocre generals had forced him to shoulder. On April 30th, he sent Grant a letter that exuded confidence in him and granted him total freedom. The confidence arose in part because he and Grant agreed on so many military matters. He wrote to him, quote, "Not expecting to see you again before the spring campaign opens, I wish to express in this way my entire satisfaction with what you have done up to this time, so far as I understand it. The particulars of your plans I neither know or seek to know. You are vigilant and self-reliant, and, pleased with this, I wish not to obtrude any constraints or restraints upon you. While I am very anxious that any great disaster or the capture of our men in great numbers shall be avoided, I know these points are less likely to escape your attention than they would be mine. If there is anything wanting which is within my power to give, do not fail to let me know it. And now, with a brave army and a just cause. May God sustain you. The one thing that Grant knew he was going to have to do was to cast this somewhat potent, to snap the spell, this potent spell that Lee had cast over the Army of the Potomac, telling one of his trusted lieutenants and men that Lee, quote, possessed the entire confidence, respect, and indeed affection of everyone under his command, and such a man should not be an indifferent commander to meet. That same day, showing a superb fingertip feel for his adversary, Lee stood atop a nearby mountain with his infantry chiefs and identified, with oracular authority, 2 of the fords where Grant would cross the Rapidan River. The next day, he suspected an imminent engagement when reports filtered back to him of billowing dust clouds on the Union side, the kind kicked up by marching soldiers, plus billowing smoke, the kind that rose from newly abandoned Army camps. And that night, Union columns were seen passing in silhouette in front of campfires, making it all but certain that Grant's crossing of that river was nearing, and it was nearing quickly. Now, the strategy of Grant's offensive movement here was to get to the city of Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederate States of America's political headquarters. And although taking Richmond would be about as symbolic as, or a victory that was only as symbolic as when the Nazis took Paris, for example, it didn't really do much. It was seen by the people as a great victory. So after lunch the next day, Grant enjoyed a cigar with his staff, sufficiently pleased with his progress that he allowed himself momentary banter. When a reporter inquired how long it would take to reach Richmond, Grant gave a mischievous reply of, quote, I will agree to be there in about 4 days. And after an astonished silence, Grant went on, quote, that is, if General Lee becomes a party to the agreement, but if he objects, the trip will undoubtedly be prolonged. And it was a type of personality that they hadn't seen yet in the leadership of the Union Army. Someone who knew how to talk to reporters and someone who understood, the humanity of all of it. And I think that's probably where people started to begin to realize that, maybe not at the time, Grant certainly didn't realize it, but he would become president because he understood the politicians and the people and the political side of warfare. And that's something that we haven't seen in this type of concentration since George Washington was leading the armies in that same area in Virginia. As lighthearted as Grant may have seemed in that interview, and as triumphant a mood as the army had been undergoing under him, that would soon fade. The Rapidan River crossing inaugurated the Overland Campaign, which was 7 weeks of brutal, remorseless fighting, so steeped in gore that one Union officer would term it, quote, a raging storm of lead and iron. Immediately south of the river lay a bleak, uninhabited region of dense vegetation known as the wilderness. It was very densely packed with stunted trees, tangled shrubs, scrub oak, and pine trees. At the Battle of Chancellorsville a year earlier, Lee had trounced General Hooker in this perilous region, mastering its mystifying terrain. As far as Lee was concerned, Grant was set to wander into the very same trap Hooker did. Lee had only 64,000 men versus Grant's 115,000, a difference that could be fatal to Lee in an open field confrontation. In the trackless maze of the wilderness, however, that advantage would vanish, and that's very similar to the 300 of the Spartans against the Persians. It was a territory or terrain that made your numbers meaningless. This tricky topography would also neutralize Grant's superior artillery. Its fire would be obstructed by the trees, and for that reason, Lee made no effort to thwart Grant's crossing of the Rapidan River and was eager to encourage it. Hoping to avoid a collision with Lee in the wilderness, Grant intended to march his men through it rapidly, then meet Lee in the open country. That night, Grant and Meade smoked before a blazing fire and hatched plans for the morning. Satisfied with the day's activity, Grant wired Halleck, quote, the crossing of the Rapidan effected. 48 hours now will demonstrate whether the enemy intends giving battle this side of Richmond. Also camped in a tent that night, Lee decided that the following day he would provoke an encounter before Grant could concentrate his enormous forces comparatively. Though he wanted to avoid a wilderness clash, Grant was scarcely less eager to fight. He had 3 corps under Winfield Scott Hancock, Governor Warren, and John Sedgwick at his disposal, while a 4th Corps under Burnside endured a grueling all-night march to join the fray. As he tensely awaited Burnside, Grant made a revealing comment to Porter when he said, quote, "The only time I ever feel impatient is when I give an order for an important movement of troops in the presence of the enemy and am waiting for them to reach their destination. Then the minutes seem like hours." Grant received word from Meade that the Confederate forces had been spotted on the Orange Turnpike, when Meade ordered Warren to pounce on them immediately. Grant endorsed this aggressive attitude, saying, quote, "If any opportunity presents itself for pitching into a part of Lee's army, do so without giving time for disposition." And for one time, Lee actually seemed to come off as a reluctant warrior, preferring to defer any general engagement until the next day, when Longstreet would strengthen him with approximately 14,000 men. Nonetheless, he wasn't the one to duck a battle, especially after Union General Charles Griffin pounded hard into one of Evil's advance brigades. The triumph was fleeting, stymied by a factor that would govern 2 days of wilderness fighting. As dry leaves and branches caught fire from exploding shells, they produced a thick curtain of smoke that trapped and blinded Griffin's men, making them vulnerable to Ewell's counterattack. Union soldiers ended up fleeing the scene. And as the Overland Campaign and the Wilderness Campaign really kicked off on May 5th, the fighting, however feverish it was fairly inconclusive. The next morning dawned bright but hazy, veiled by hanging smoke. Showing his inborn fighting spirit, Grant sent orders through Meade to pummel Lee's army as early as possible, as much as he had done on the second day of Shiloh. Quote, "It was my plan then, as it was on all other occasions, to take the initiative wherever the enemy could be drawn from his entrenchments." Eager to fight, he planned to attack Lee at 4:30 a.m. until Meade pleaded that the men were just exhausted and argued for 6 a.m. Grant grudgingly allowed an extension until 5 a.m. And throughout the Overland Campaign, he would do something that had been never done before in this war. He would force Lee to react to him, striking first, setting the pace, and shaping the contours of the battle. At 4 a.m., Grant rose and breakfast was served on a cucumber soaked in vinegar, washed down with black coffee. Then he stuffed his pockets with cigars and retreated to a little knoll to superintend the battle. He paced as he awaited the opening guns at 5 a.m., right on schedule. Hancock led 2 divisions up the Orange Plank Road and smashed the enemy so hard the Confederate line reeled backward, chased for a mile into the woods until it was dispersed in confusion. It seemed that total victory was in his grasp, and his gloating was immature that he was doing to Grant. Finding himself in an exposed forward position, Lee saw hundreds of soldiers from A.P. Hill's corps streaming back towards him. Lee endeavored on horseback to arrest their retreat. He would have failed had it not been for the timely arrival of Longstreet's troops. And as he saw this retreat streaming by him, he was overcome with emotion. Lee asked which brigade this was, and someone answered him, the Texas Brigade. And he said, quote, "Hurrah for Texas," waving his hat with delirious joy. Still gripped by powerful emotion, he scurried to spearhead the Texas Brigade, leading the counterattack himself. The soldiers, observing this brave folly, they rushed to curb it, and they shouted, "Lee to the rear! Lee to the rear!" And they finally prevailed him to hang back. One soldier actually took the bridle of his horse and escorted him to the rear. This extraordinary moment disclosed Lee's battlefield zest and mystic bond with his men. Backed by Longstreet, Lee cobbled together a revived force, and his men crept furtively along and exploded from the closed woods in a stinging assault against Grant's men. In 2 hours, they wiped out any Union gains that had been made earlier. The Confederate advance halted when Longstreet was struck by friendly fire in the neck and shoulder, an injury that would paralyze his right arm and sideline him for 5 months. When he heard them bemoaning his death, Longstreet lifted his hat with a good arm to reassure them that he was still alive. And Lee, who was stunned, said, quote, "I shall not soon forget the sadness in his face and almost despairing moment of his hands when he was told that Longstreet had fallen." I'm sorry, that was a soldier saying of Lee his reaction to that. Grant knew Longstreet's worth to Lee, and reflecting that it, quote, "compensated in a great measure for the mishap or misapprehensions which had fallen to their lot during the day." In the convoluted web of the wilderness, Grant had to form a picture of the battle in his mind. There wasn't a hilltop ledge with he could survey his men, and only 2 or 3 times in 2 days of combat did Grant ride out on his horse named Cincinnati and witness the fighting firsthand. He seemed undisturbed when enemy shells burst nearby, refusing to relocate to a safer place, saying, quote, "It would be better to order up some artillery and defend the present location." And if Grant had to make an instant decision, Badeau wrote, quote, "It was made and uttered instantly and unflinchingly, though it involved the fate of a corps. At these supreme moments, the dullest perceived his intensity, the most unwilling admitted his power." And that's the kind of man that Grant was. And on that thickly wooded knoll, Grant had to be guided by sound more than sight, combined with dispatches rushed to him into his hands by breathless couriers. Likely, he could adapt swiftly to a shifting array of battlefield forces. The dense foliage, which made artillery useless, led to hand-to-hand combat of an appalling character. This frenzied fighting was like a deadly game of blind man's bluff, with both armies flailing wildly at each other, their visions blinkered by floating smoke. After an early afternoon lull in the fighting, it resumed at 4:15 p.m. as Lee mounted a furious attack. Within an hour, Hancock had repulsed the movement, but not before a terrifying event in this battle unfolded. The woods started burning again. Exploding shells ignited dry brush and pine needles, heating the forest into a raging inferno. Adding to that conflagration were wooded Union breastworks, which blazed up with incredible speed. Wounded men were roasted alive on the forest floor. Their agonized cries were audible everywhere. Many committed suicide rather than burned to death. Swirling smoke asphyxiated soldiers on both sides, and Porter remembered how, quote, "The wind howled through the treetops, mingling its moans with the groans of the dying, and heavy branches were cut off by the fire of the artillery and fell crashing upon the heads of men, adding a new terror to the battle." Blood-smeared, hideous garments clung to bushes, and many survivors said the scene approached as neat to the scenes of hell as they could ever picture. Stanton would christen the wilderness, quote, "the bloodiest swath ever made on this globe." And that is what the Wilderness Campaign would be known for. It's the hideousness, the realization of war and what it really is. That was the Wilderness Campaign. And by the time the darkness had descended upon the battlefield that night, the Union line had reformed on the right, and Gordon and his men retreated to their entrenchments, ending the Wilderness Battle after 2 days of hectic fighting and unspeakable carnage. Even having experienced the Battle of Shiloh, Grant still wrote that, quote, "More desperate fighting has not been witnessed on this continent." Characteristically, the tightly buttoned Grant allowed himself release only once the crisis passed. He carried the full weight of the Union cause on his shoulders, an impossible burden for any man. So perhaps, not surprisingly, he submitted to an overflow of feeling. Rawlins related the event, saying, quote, "When all proper measures had been taken, Grant went into his tent, threw himself face downward on his cot, and gave way to the greatest emotion. The man of extreme self-control surrendered to his feelings," and Rawlins asserted, quote, "He had never before seen him so deeply moved. Nothing could be more certain than that he was stirred to the very depths of his soul." After Grant experienced this tremendous catharsis, he snapped back to his usual self, showing his recuperative powers. Others who saw him that night were no less struck by the calm that settled over him. 10 minutes later, another man close to the scene, Porter, wrote, quote, "I looked in his tent and found him sleeping as soundly and peacefully as an infant." And that goes to show you Grant's understanding of the battle. He experienced a true catharsis for the loss of his men, but understood the full weight of what he had in front of him. Now, in the immediate aftermath of the Wilderness, Grant speculated that Confederate forces had suffered more casualties than his own, but the reality was the reverse. 17,500 Union casualties exceeded the 11,000 suffered by the Confederates. Nevertheless, the Wilderness was deemed a clear-cut Union victory, since Grant's men by the end found themselves, quote, "masters of the field, the enemy having withdrawn." Grant refused to concede victory to Lee. It may seem self-serving, but he had sound reasons. He wrote, quote, "Our victory consisted in having successfully crossed a formidable stream almost in the face of an enemy and in getting the army together as a unit." He thought in terms of the overall war, not the individual battles, and he would now initiate a new style of warfare, an uninterrupted stream of battles such as the war had never seen. This Wilderness Campaign, it only toughened Grant's resolve. Robert E. Lee had failed to tame Grant, who didn't shrink from the seas of blood through which his men would have to wade. He summed up Grant's style by saying, quote, "The great thing about Grant in his perfect coolness and persistence of purpose, he is not easily excited, and he has the grit of a bulldog. Once let him get his teeth in, and nothing can shake him off." And those were Abraham Lincoln's words. One other person who understood that Grant was quite unlike any of his predecessors was his chief antagonist, Robert E. Lee. As both sides buried their dead, General Gordon boasted that there was, quote, "no doubt but that Grant is retreating." "You are mistaken," Lee corrected him. "Quite mistaken. Grant is not retreating. He is not a retreating man." Whitman, who ardently followed the Overland Campaign, wrote, quote, "When did Grant ever turn back? He was not that sort. He could no more turn back than time. Grant was one of those inevitables. He always arrived. He was invincible as a law. He never bragged, often seemed about to be defeated when he was in fact on the eve of a tremendous victory." From this point on, Lee would be thrust permanently on the defensive by Grant, who would set the agenda for the coming battles, defining the war's geography and scope. By shifting to the left in a bold flank movement, he hoped to shield Washington from raids and effect an early junction with Butler and his Army of the James, which had landed safely at City Point on the James River. Under the cover of darkness, Grant planned the stealthy overnight evacuation of his army into Spotsylvania Courthouse, a dozen miles southeast, in what reverberates as an incredible parallel to the overnight retreats that George Washington was so masterfully pulling off in the Revolutionary War. Although sections of the forest still burned, throwing a lurid glow into the sky, and the stench of charred human flesh permeated the air, they made their stealthy re-movement campaign. And it seems almost otherworldly the way that Grant was able to understand his soldiers, because he understood that the soldiers knew, based on the direction they were moving, if it was a retreat or an offensive. And even though they were defeated by numbers on that wilderness campaign in that battle, Grant was going on the offensive. And when the troops who had up to this point retreated from something like that realized that they weren't moving in the way of retreat and they were going on the offensive, they were overjoyed, and it increased the morale of the army to a point which they had never seen before. And it was almost as if Grant had superhuman powers to understand how to affect his troops. Now, the troops were not the only one who understood that Grant was going on the offensive, and endowed with an eerie intuition that he had carried throughout the entire war, Lee had accurately forecast Grant's next movement to his generals. He said, quote, "Grant is not going to retreat. He will move his army to Spotsylvania." And this kicked off the campaign known as the Spotsylvania Campaign. The heat was brutal, the troops were exhausted, and a pall of dust and smoke hung everywhere. The landscape at Spotsylvania Courthouse presented complex challenges to Grant. It had pockets of thick forests with big pines, scrub oaks, and were punctuated by clearings, swamps, and gently rolling hills that benefited an army on the defenses such as Lee, who ordered his men to build elaborate fortifications unprecedented in their breadth and sophistication. One mocked as, quote, "King of Spades" for his predilection for digging trenches, Lee had now refined the art of defensive warfare. Confederate forces at Spotsylvania, they featured loopholes that allowed marksmen to fire safely at Grant's troops. In the opinion of one Union officer, Lee's line was constructed, quote, "in a manner unknown to European warfare, and indeed in a new manner of warfare in this country." These deep entrenchments, they anticipated the Western Front in World War I, really. It would be the bane of Grant's campaign against Lee that he usually had to attack him in fortified positions, whereas Lee could shift troops nimbly, employing short interior lines because of these enforcements. And at 9:30 in the morning on May 10th, Grant prepared for a furious onslaught in Spotsylvania. He wrote a quick telegram to General Halleck with a vintage statement saying, quote, "I shall take no backward step." He ordered about another 50 rounds of ammunition for each of his 100,000 men. Still, he sounded less cocky than before and certainly more modest about thrashing Lee. Quote, "We can maintain ourselves at least, and in the end beat Lee's army, I believe." Grant probed for a chink in Lee's extended line and assailed his center, only to be thrown back with heavy losses. During this long day of bloody mayhem, he moved his headquarters tent to the margin of a wood, One adjutant remembered standing 20 feet from Grant when a shell, quote, passed 3 inches from his ear. Without missing a beat, Grant told his new aide, Captain Peter Hudson, "Hudson, get that shell. Let's see what kind of ammunition they are using." With this type of composure, Grant smoked and wrote dispatches seemingly unaware of having barely escaped death. One Union wounded Wisconsin soldier, borne on a stretcher past Grant, observed approvingly, quote, "Ulysses don't scare worth a damn." That's probably one of the best quotes to sum up General Grant. And it was his eternal assumption that when his adversary, Robert E. Lee, strengthened one part of his line, he weakened another. So upon learning that Lee had buttressed his left, Grant ordered an afternoon attack at the enemy's center. He devised an ingenious solution. He took 12 regiments, arranged them into 4 lines, and had them absolutely race toward the ground known as Mule Shoe, and they were howling like men that were possessed. The novelty of this method was when the first line reached the Confederate defenses, it split left and right, opening a path for the second line to rush in and take up the assault. And this line, in turn, splayed left and right, creating an opening for the third and fourth in succession. And to speed up the charge, soldiers were told to withhold fire until they reached the Confederate defenders. General Badeau recalled this tour de force of tactical innovation, saying, quote, "Allowing nothing to stop them, creeping on his hands and knees over all obstacles, even under fire, they climbed the hill and completely broke the lines in their front, capturing an entire brigade of infantry and a battery of artillery. 1,000 startled rebel prisoners fell into Union hands." And, as in the wilderness, this forest burst into flames, frying to death many soldiers disabled on the battlefield. Before leaving Washington, Grant had been authorized to promote officers in the field for special acts of gallantry, and on the spot he made Upton a brevet brigadier general, and in later years paid tribute to his sterling achievements at Spotsylvania. Quote, "He gave us the first really American system of tactics, a want our army had long felt. His system of tactics, adopted by the War Department, made intelligent operations possible on any kind of ground." Of that late afternoon attack against the Confederate line, Congressman Washburn wrote in his diary, quote, "Generals Grant and Meade rode onto a ridge in front of the timber where the battle was raging. It was at its heights just as the sun was going down. The roar of musketry and cannon and the cheers of our men as they rushed to make the charge made an impression never to be effaced. It has been a day of continuous fighting, and our losses have been heavy, but we have gained decided advantage." That night, briefing a reporter on the day's action, Grant struck a playful tone when he said, quote, "We have hard fighting today, and I am sorry to say we have not accomplished much. We have lost a good many men, and I suppose that I shall be blamed for it." I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say joking tone, a rueful tone, let's say. He continued and said, quote, "I do not know any way to put down this rebellion and restore the authority of the government except by fighting, and fighting means that men must be killed. If the people of this country expect that the war can be conducted to a successful issue in any other way than fighting, they must get somebody other than myself to command the army." And the next morning, on May 11th, cold and rainy after 2 weeks of broiling weather, Grant enjoyed a slow breakfast, a tiny piece of beef, cooked well enough to drain any juice from it, and black coffee. He stood before his tent smoking his cigar and bid farewell to Washburn, who was returning to Washington. Then came an immortal line that would be emblazoned in the press and trail him forever. Quote, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes me all summer." Grant eventually struck out the word "me," and it was forever known as "if it takes all summer," which served as a very unifying quote for the Union cause. If it took all summer, we would just continue to fight. And in an unseen stroke of fortune, a rebel deserter alerted Grant to the news that Lee was moving his men, and Grant decided to attack the spot around daylight next morning. The charge came around 4:30 in the morning with an uphill climb for Hancock and his men, who had to negotiate a march and wend their way through thickly wooded territory. They pressed toward the bulging Mule Shoe, as it was known, in constant rain, and early gray light as morning mist helped to screen their movements. When they emerged into a clearing before the breastworks, 15,000 of them strong, they let loose a tremendous cheer and surged forward without firing a shot. One Union soldier recalled how, quote, "the great mass of men, with a rush like a cyclone, sprang upon the entrenchments and swarmed over. Here, in a scene of wild turmoil, the two armies collided at such close quarters that they bashed each other to death with rifle butts and bayonets. In an hour of frantic fighting, Hancock captured 4,000 prisoners plus 30 cannon. And back in the dell, enthusiastic riders galloped up with the news, eliciting cheers from Grant's staff, while Grant sat, quote, unmoved upon his camp chair, giving his constant thoughts to devising methods for making the victory complete. The captured division belonged to Major General Edward Johnson. It was soon hauled into Grant's presence as a prisoner. Periodically throughout the battle, Grant mounted his horse named Little Jeff Davis and rode to observation posts to survey the bloodbath at the Muleshoe. Nearby was a secluded clearing where zigzagging trenches formed a sharp angle known in historical annals as the Bloody Angle. As an emblem of the sheer hell of war, few places surpass this claustrophobic spot. Trenches filled with a soupy mixture of rain, mud, and blood, leading some wounded men to drown. Troops fought hand-to-hand atop the parapets in such squalid disorder that they often stood on dead men as they battled. One Massachusetts soldier remembered dead and wounded rebels, quote, piled up in heaps of 3 or 4 deep. Each new wave of oncoming men trampled comrades fallen before them until the ground grew slippery with their blood. Frantic soldiers thrust swords and bayonets through gaps in the log parapets, killing foes that were only partly visible until a welter of mangled limbs accumulated. The incessant musket fire shredded trees and shrubs into twigs, leading Porter to comment, quote, "We had not only shot down an army, but also a forest." And for him, the savagery, quote, "was probably the most desperate engagement in the history of modern warfare." And for those unlucky enough to fight there, the day furnished ghoulish vignettes that would never forget, as Charles Dana stared into a trench, quote, "The leg of a man was lifted up from the pool and mud dripped off his boot. It was so unexpected, so horrible, that for a moment we were all stunned. And the jumble of dead bodies made it hard to extract the wounded, who lay gasping for air below them." As Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote, quote, "Wounded were often writhing under superincumbent dead. It was not long after dark when Confederate soldiers withdrew, leaving many dead to be buried in the trenches where they had fallen." Grant interpreted the day's fighting as a victory and nominated Hancock for brigadier general in the regular army. In a telegram, he noted that the Union Army had captured an entire division, brigade, and regiment while keeping his own units intact. Be that as it may, Grant had incurred heavy casualties since crossing the Rapidan River, a total of 30,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, which had surpassed the total for all Union armies combined in any previous week of the war. The corresponding Confederate toll came to 18,000, and at the same time he had severely depleted the officer corps of Lee's army, taking, killing, or wounding 20 of the 57 Corps division and brigade commanders. Those were very important losses for Lee. And if his main objective was to grind down the Army of Northern Virginia, he had made an effective, if costly, beginning of it. One Louisiana soldier voiced a dispiriting thought that had begun to sink across the entire South. Quote, "We have met a man this time who either does not know when he is whipped or who cares not if he loses his whole army so that he may accomplish an end." Lee was sobered by his encounter with Grant when he heard officers castigating Grant for, quote, butchering his men. Lee didn't let the comment pass unnoticed. According to one of his generals, he replied, quote, "Gentlemen, I think General Grant has managed his affairs remarkably well up to this present time. Grant was wearing us out and starving us out. He hammered at us continually. He knew we couldn't replace our men and that he could." And the heavy rain caused a 2-day gap in the fighting, which Grant devoted to the sad duty of interring the dead and carting off the wounded to temporary field hospitals. Roads were churned into a muddy lather by the downpour, and by the night of May 14th, Porter wrote Grant, quote, "was a mass of mud from head to foot, his uniform being scarcely recognizable." The pause in fighting gave Grant time to reflect that he seemed chastened by the barbaric intensity of the fighting. Pouring out his thoughts to his wife Julia, he paid tribute to the indomitable grit of Confederate troops, which had clearly astounded him. The enemy, he reported, quote, "are fighting with great desperation, entrenching themselves in every position they take up. The world has never seen so bloody or so protracted a battle as the one being fought, and I hope never will again. As bad as it is, they have fought for their cause with a gallantry worthy of a better. On May 19th, in a rare offensive thrust against General Grant, Lee unloaded a surprise attack in the late afternoon which turned bloody for both sides. As usual, Grant perceived opportunity where others saw blind terror, instructing Porter to, quote, ride to the point of attack and urge upon the commanders not only to check the advance of the enemy, but to take the offensive and destroy them if possible. By that nightfall, Confederate troops were driven back in what proved Lee's last offensive attack of the war. Henceforth, he would exploit the advantages of fixed defensive positions. One feature that sanguinary day has received insufficient attention, the bravery of the black soldiers under Brigadier General Edward Ferrero. Quote, it was at that first time at the East when colored troops had been engaged in any important battle, and the display of soldierly qualities obtained a frank acknowledgment from both troops and commanders. Not all of whom had been willing to look upon Negroes as comrades. Grant decreed a secret midnight march by his left flank, ordering Hancock, quote, to get as far towards Richmond on the line of Fredericksburg Railroad as he can make, fighting the enemy in whatever force he may find him. For Grant, the important thing was the constant and inexorable push southward. Finding his progress delayed by slow-moving artillery, he shipped back 100 pieces to Washington. He played a cat-and-mouse game with Lee, even pretending to commit an error that might tempt his rival to pounce. He deliberately left Hancock's entire corps apart from the rest of his army, hoping that Lee might try to attack, but he never took the bait. Never short of confidence, he predicted to his staff surgeon, quote, if I can get one more pull at him, I will defeat him. Clearly, Grant faced a far more self-assured rival than he had ever confronted before, and one who seemed to seldom make mistakes, as that was Lee, who said that about Grant. The stress of the Overland Campaign, which had been spent on the men from punishing night marches, battle smoke, sleep deprivation, and never-ending skirmishes, the soldiers were dazed by the strain of that campaign. The cumulative pressures overwhelmed many, and Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. said that, quote, many a man has gone crazy since this campaign began from the terrible pressure on body and mind. The men in the ranks did not look as they did when they entered the wilderness. Their uniforms were now torn, ragged, and stained with mud. The men had grown thin and haggard. The experience of those 20 days seemed to have added 20 years to their age. And despite this outward change, Grant had wrought a profound alteration in the soldiers' psyche. He made them believe in themselves. And in a very striking parallel, as he made the men believe in themselves, he made the Union cause believe in his army. Because with each battle, and with each catastrophic death toll, they marched closer and closer to Richmond, and Grant was keenly aware that with each battle, although there were startling numbers of death, he was slowly wearing down Lee's army, and they were getting closer to Richmond, and that was not something that Lee would be able to sustain. And on June 2nd, with sweltering weather, Grant and his staff were quartered near Bethesda Church. The idyllic scene gave nearly no warning of the disaster that laid ahead. Grant had hoped for a dawn attack against Lee, but then put it off twice because of delayed troop movements. Wrangling commanders and hungry men exhausted from nocturnal marches were slowing things down. He wanted to make one last effort to flush Lee from behind miles of trenches and log parapets, forcing him into the open. In retrospect, it would seem like a fool's errand, and this was the famous Battle of Cold Harbor. Lee inhabited swampy terrain that played to his strong suit, his men crouching behind gullies and thickets that interposed natural barriers. The enforced delay in Grant's offensive enabled Lee's men to perfect a labyrinth of trenches that would defy any forward movement by the Army of Potomac and Grant. So complex were those defenses that they more than offset the Union's advantage of 109,000 men to the Confederate 59,000. That should speak to how advanced those trenches were. Nobody underestimated the perils awaiting the Union Army the next morning. As in many Civil War battles, fatalistic soldiers pinned their names and addresses on snippets of paper fastened to the backs of their coats in case their corpses had to be identified. At 4:30 in the morning, on the misty morning of June 3rd, 60,000 Union soldiers dashed toward the center and right of the long Confederate line, braving a hail of musket fire and artillery that rained thickly upon them. Some of the Union units had received transient success by taking the first line of rifle pits and prisoners, but these bright spots were soon dwarfed by calamitous losses. Thwarted by marshy land, brush, and woods, the ill-fated charge ran straight into a several-layered defense system that was literally impenetrable. One journalist evoked the, quote, intricate zigzagged lines within lines, lines protecting flanks of lines, lines built to enfilade opposite lines, works within works, and works without works. Not a single Confederate soldier needed to venture outside of these well-protected shelters that they had made. Meanwhile, Union soldiers who were crashing through smoke and flame proved very easy targets for the Confederate marksmen, who mowed them down in dreadful numbers, turning the battlefield into a butcher house. The air grew dark with rifle bullets, shells, solid shot, and rolling smoke. One soldier wrote, quote, it seemed more like a volcanic blast than a battle, and was just about as destructive. So murderous was this Cold Harbor gunfire that Union soldiers dropped to the ground using dead bodies of their fallen comrades as sandbags. After listening to their gloomy reports, he suspended further operations a little after noon, as Grant and his army had paid a fearful price for their misguided assault, losing 7,000 men, mostly in the first hour, against only 1,500 casualties for Lee. In the lacerating verdict of the Confederate General Evander Law, Cold Harbor was, quote, not war but murder. One of Lee's staff officers sneered at Grant's costly error, calling Cold Harbor, quote, perhaps the easiest victory ever granted to the Confederate arms by the folly of Federal commanders. As Grant eventually admitted with extreme understatement, it was the one attack during the Overland Campaign that did not inflict upon the enemy losses to compensate for our own loss. Cold Harbor became a byword for senseless slaughter. It was after the Cold Harbor battle that Grant executed a stunning about-face and strategy. As shown by his pre-war habits, he loved to gamble. He knew Lee would never emerge from his fortifications and that further frontal assaults would be a general suicidal rate of casualties, leaving him no choice but to adopt a slower course of a siege. It would be less romantic work, for which he was temperamentally unsuited, but it struck no less terror into Lee, who knew he couldn't survive a siege indefinitely. Grant had driven Lee into a box from which he could not escape easily as he defended Richmond and Petersburg. Grant worried that Lee might swoop down on Butler and the Army of the James before he could rescue them, and for that reason he elected to make a swift, secret movement to his left, taking 115,000 men to a point south of the James River. If he could seize the vital railroad junction of Petersburg, 20 miles below Richmond, he would sever southern railroads that sustained Lee's army. With the surrounding countryside stripped of supplies, Lee depended heavily on produce sent by rail. As the hub for 5 railroads, Petersburg was the crucial portal for Richmond. If that fell, Richmond and Lee's army fell, and the war would hasten to a speedy conclusion. And for that reason, before moving his army south, Grant sent cavalry west under Sheridan to wreck the Virginia Central Railroad, eliminating that supply source for Lee. By June 12th, the weather had turned cool and windy, and that night, after dark, Grant began to march his army towards the James River. Staff officers noticed the tense way that Grant relit cigars constantly and reacted with monosyllables, yes, yes, go on, go on. In this splendid night of moonlight, the tramp of feet lifted swirling dust that soon obscured the stars. By the next morning, in a logistical masterpiece, very parallel to Washington's in the Revolutionary War, the Army of the Potomac had vacated the Cold Harbor trenches. Lee had been completely fooled by the exodus and was thunderstruck to discover that Grant's entire army of 115,000 men had completely vanished in the night. To confound Lee further, Grant had ordered some units to conduct diversionary feints towards Richmond. Grant's army crossed the Chickahominy River and reached the formidable James River barrier. He needed to make his massive army across a waterway 2,000 feet wide and 84 feet deep. To Julia, his wife, he described the operation as, quote, one of the most perilous movements ever executed by a large army, crossing 2 rivers over which the enemy has bridges and railroads whilst we have bridges to improvise. I am in excellent health and feel no doubt about holding the enemy in much greater alarm than I have ever felt in my life. Miraculously, the entire brigade was crossed and the whole thing completed shortly after midnight. By the summer of 1864, Northern victory seemed tantalizingly close, if only Richmond or Atlanta were taken. By now, General Sherman preached a doctrine of total warfare that grew ever more militant. His letters to Grant throbbed with a burning sense of vengeance as he planned to widen the war to engulf civilian society and obliterate the South's productive capacity. And it ended up in the very famous March to the Sea that Sherman took. As his men trooped south, Sherman took note of enemy resilience. Quote, "No amount of poverty or adversity seems to shake their faith. Niggers gone, wealth and luxury gone, money worthless, yet I see no sign of let up. Only violence on a massive scale, as he believed, would subdue such a hardy and refractory breed. Quote, I begin to regard the death and mangling of a couple thousand men as a small affair, a kind of morning dash. The worst of war is not yet begun." He also wished to inflict psychological damage on the Southern people because the North was not only fighting a hostile army but a hostile people. Better bring the war to a speedy conclusion by hard fighting, he thought, than prolong the suffering of the conflict. Sherman's arrival on the city fringes of Atlanta provoked an exodus of fear-stricken residents. He believed it crucial that Grant keep Lee pinned down, unable to assist the rebel army in Atlanta, exactly the sort of integrated strategic thinking that Grant had favored. By July of 1864, with spirits slumping in the North and Lincoln's election prospects dampened by the abysmal rate of casualties in Virginia, Grant wanted badly to get away from this siege warfare. Now, during a Vicksburg siege, he had experimented with digging a mine under enemy defenses and blowing them up. Grant endorsed a similar plan proposed by Ambrose Burnside. Burnside boasted that by excavating tunnels, that, quote, we could blow that damn fort out of existence if we could run a mine shaft under it. And on June 25th, the miners began gouging out a tunnel that would secretly span the 100 yards separating Union and Confederate lines. Repeating the reason he had invoked for the quixotic schemes at Vicksburg, Grant wrote in his memoirs that he approved the plans as a means of keeping the men occupied, if nothing else. On July 23rd, the excavation ended its initial phase. The main gallery ran 511 feet long and ended just 23 feet below the Confederate parapet. All that remained was to pack the tunnel with 8,000 pounds of explosives and blow the rebels to kingdom come. Grant concocted a characteristic trick. He sent out a whole corps under Hancock with Sheridan's cavalry to wreck the Virginia Central Railroad and drew a large portion of Lee's troops to the north side of the James in defense. Sheridan proved adept at the deception. Under the cover of night, he snuck his men back across the James River, carpeting a pontoon bridge with moss and earth to muffle the tramp of soldiers. Then by day, he sent them across the James again to create the illusion that most of Grant's army was being evacuated. Steamboat captains blew whistles, adding to the charade of a sudden retreat. The main aim of this trick was to weaken Petersburg defenses, making them vulnerable to the hole Grant hoped to blow through them. When this maneuver was completed, he was ready to ignite the mine and pour 15,000 troops into the fray. Grant and his men awaited the mine explosion, hoping for a spectacular turn in fighting. And shortly before 5 a.m. on July 30th, the mine was triggered. With a fearsome roar, the earth was torn asunder, spewing a colossal cloud of dirt, dust, and smoke as broken muskets whirled into a rebel regiment and demolishing an artillery battery. Body parts were mangled everywhere. One observer compared the lethal cloud to, quote, an immense mushroom whose stem seemed to be set of fire and its head of smoke. The blast carved a crater 30 feet deep, 60 feet wide, and 170 feet long. One Confederate gunner remembered the dust column, quote, hurtling downward with a roaring sound, showers of stones, broken timbers, and blackened human limbs, the gloomy pall of darkening smoke flushing in an angry crimson before the rising sun. Then came the thunderous boom of 110 Union cannon and 50 mortars swinging into cooperative action. All seemed to proceed according to plan until the commanding attacker, his division rushed into the breach and they lost their way. Their commander was nowhere to be found and his men milled around amid that smoking debris. Although the Cemetery Hill commanded a direct route into Petersburg and was a mere 300 or 400 yards away, it wasn't taken. As Grant explained, he hadn't wanted Burnside's corps to, quote, to stop in the crater at all, but to push on to the top of the hill. He ignored those instructions, and he was holed up in a bomb-proof trench taking refuge in a bottle of rum. They stood there, adrift and defenseless, exposed to Confederate fire. Quote, the shouting, screaming, and cheering, wrote Horace Porter, mingled with the roar of artillery and explosion of shells created a perfect pandemonium. The crater had become a cauldron of hell. Simply dressed in a blue blouse and trousers in the blazing heat, Grant rode down to the front after the detonation, negotiating the final portion on foot. His face was pasted with dust and sweat. Distracted soldiers brushed past him, not even knowing it was him. He jumped over the parapet, exposing himself to enemy fire, and saw that the chance to advance had been mangled. Quote, these troops must be immediately withdrawn, he ordered. It is a slaughter to leave them here. Even though the Confederates had been caught off guard, giving the men plenty of time to rush forward and capture Petersburg, the opportunity had been squandered. And it wasn't so much the conception of the plan as it was its execution that had proven gravely defective. Belatedly, in one of the most tragic events of this entire battle, General Burnside threw his Black Division, commanded by Brigadier General Edward Ferrero, into the maelstrom. By this time, Union soldiers stood entrapped in a deep hole, easy targets for Confederate grenades. The black troops, who behaved gallantly, simply swelled the churning mass of soldiers meandering around, and by now the rebels, yelling racial epithets, had counterattacked and hurled grenades down at the black troops, who had no place to hide. In a burst of sadistic behavior, rebel soldiers responded with, quote, a bayonet thrust to cries for water from injured black soldiers. Those who attempted to surrender were killed. Union forces suffered nearly 4,000 dead, wounded, or missing, more than twice the number of their opponents, 500 of them black. Even in the face of these staggering losses for Grant, by late August, Lee himself had felt the pain of the terrifying tourniquet that Grant was applying to his army, telling Jefferson Davis, quote, I think it is the enemy's purpose to endeavor to compel the evacuation of our present position by cutting off our supplies. It behooves us to do everything in our power to thwart his new plan of reducing us by starvation. In early September, Lee confirmed that Grant was forcing him to fly blind in his own territory and react to Union initiatives. It was clear that Grant was in charge, setting the tempo and agenda, cramping Lee's style. Quote, the enemy's position enables him to move around his troops to right or left without our knowledge, until he has reached the point at which he aims, and we are then compelled to hurry our men to meet him, incurring the risk of being too late to check his progress. On the morning of August 9th, Grant had just returned to City Point when the war came unexpectedly close to his headquarters on the James River. A Confederate agent, John Maxwell, slipped through Union lines, clambered aboard a barge loaded with shells and ammunition, and planted gunpowder in a timing mechanism as he hurried from the scene. A huge explosion threw up a towering shower of shells, bullets, splinters, iron bars, and human limbs, flinging them so high and far that fragments littered the ground a quarter-mile away. By coincidence, Grant was sitting in front of his tent, chatting with General George Sharp, who had fretted about the possible plots being hatched by nearby Confederate spies. Grant lived up to his image by exhibiting perfect sang-froid amid the mayhem. As the commissary, Chief Michael R. Morgan, recalled, quote, I saw General Grant at his usual gait walking up from his tent towards the adjutant general's tent, taking things coolly and seemingly not thinking anything out of the ordinary was taking place. He took no precautions aside from ducking behind a large tree. And another man seems to remember that Grant was, quote, the only man who at the first shock ran towards the scene of terror was Lieutenant General Grant. 5 minutes later, with his yard full of splinters and shell fragments, Grant filed a report with Halleck claiming the death toll had reached 53 men, including 38 black laborers. Since Grant was congenitally heedless of danger and resisted extra security, his staff secretly organized a night watch to protect him. That watch Grant never learned about until this special layer of security, until his second term as president. Later on September 29th, in a surprise raid, the Army of the James had taken Fort Harrison, which formed part of Richmond's outer defenses, and was studded with big guns. And typically for Grant, he had an ulterior strategic motive to force Lee to strengthen Richmond and thereby weaken Petersburg. When Grant rushed over to the captured fort, he found himself stepping gingerly over dead bodies strewn across the ground. One soldier wrote, quote, "He turned his looks upward to avoid as much as possible the ghastly sight, and the expression of profound grief impressed upon his features told, as usual, of the effect produced upon him by the sad spectacle." According to Badeau, quote, "A dead man lay at his feet whose head had been taken off. The blood and masses of hair from the scalp of wounded rebels were scattered around, while Grant wrote, shells flew over the fort by the score. 2 burst immediately over his head, but he never looked up, though. Men and officers ran for cover for the fragments." Grant's strategy was working better than he knew. Lee's lines were stretched so taut that on November 2nd he warned Jefferson, quote, "I fear a great calamity will befall us." And Adam Badeau marveled at how coolly Grant directed all the moving pieces of the war when he said, quote, "While here, Grant goes out to every front, is under fire for hours together, and at the same time he receives dispatches from Sherman 1,000 miles away and directs the movements of his army at Atlanta, of another in Louisiana, of the forces of Mobile, and smokes his cigar in calm and quiet all the while." Grant somehow decides that the war needs to speed up and we need to end all this calamity. Grant's major reservation about a march to the sea from Sherman, which was shared by Lincoln, was that John Bell Hood's army might lurch northward and jeopardize Tennessee unopposed. Unfazed, General Sherman promised he would dispatch Thomas to the state with 60,000 men to safeguard its security. What Sherman aimed was to shift the whole calculus of the war, lunging across a broad swath of Southern territory, not to hunt down an army, but to demolish the civilian foundations of the war. His fiery procession would make a major statement about unmatched Northern might versus Southern weakness. And it was from this point on that the war took a turn that it hadn't seen before, that can only be described in General Sherman's own words when he said of Georgia's roads, houses, and people, quote, "I can make them march and make Georgia howl."